and welcome everyone to the very first of the Medieval Academy of America's Graduate Committee's first official event of the academic year, Medievalism Uncloistered, bringing underrepresented voices into the conversation. We're really looking forward to offering our graduate student community many more opportunities to get together and think about how we can build our practices as early career medievalists. Later this semester, we're offering a webinar on open source medieval studies. And in February 2025, we'll be hosting a two-part webinar and workshop on writing creatively as academics. All of our virtual webinars and workshops are available for later viewing on the MAA's YouTube page. So if you missed anything today, or you have a friend who wasn't able to make it, or you want a refresher course on previously covered topics like grant writing, podcasting, and making the most of archival research, you can always watch those at your leisure. And if you're planning ahead for the 2025 conference season, be sure to join us for our sessions and socials at the MAA's annual meeting in March, the ICMS at Kalamazoo in May, and the IMC at Leeds in July. Whether you're attending conferences in person or from a distance, you may also benefit from taking part in the GSC's mentoring program, which helps students establish professional contacts with scholars who can offer them career advice and opportunities to expand their professional network. To take part in the mentoring program as either a mentor or mentee, you can fill out the sign-up form available on our committee's webpage. In other news, the MAA's Multicultural Middle Ages podcast, which was founded by one of our guests here today, John Correa-Reyes, is seeking submissions for its fourth season. You can find the full CFP online via the MAA's newsletter or the podcast's social media accounts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I believe the deadline to contribute is October 11th. Yes. So finally, we'd like to encourage you to get in contact with us with all your ideas, wants, and needs. If you feel like we're missing something, good or bad, we'd really like to know. Our purpose is to act on behalf of graduate student members of the Academy, to address your concerns, to promote your work, and to offer opportunities for growth. So please do stay in touch via email, Twitter, or Facebook. All of our contact information is available on the website. So the way that this panel is going to go is that I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists some individual questions and then open up into a group discussion. If you have any questions, I would really encourage you to participate by putting them in the Zoom chat or in the Q&A feature, and we will save those, and be sure to save time to ask our panelists at the end. So with that, I will introduce our speakers in alphabetical order, to make sure that no egos get involved. First, we have John Correa-Reyes. Jonathan Correa-Reyes is assistant professor of English at Clemson University. His research explores formulations of race and race thinking in medieval romances. He has articles forthcoming in Speculum, Post-Medieval, and Viator. His research has been supported by the Ford Foundation. He is also co-founder and co-producer of the Multicultural Middle Ages podcast. Second, we have Stefanie Matabang. Stefanie Matabang is a PhD candidate in comparative literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. She received her BA as a Celtic Studies and English double major at the University of California, Berkeley. She is recipient of the University of California Office of the President Dissertation Year Award and is currently a Fulbright Fellow. Her dissertation, Filipino Fantasies Under Colonization, Medievalisms, Identities, and Nationalism During the Philippines' Long Colonial Era, elucidates medievalism's thorny relationship with the development of Filipino nationalism and a modern Filipino identity throughout the Spanish, American, and Japanese colonial periods during which fantasies of the European Middle Ages experienced sensational popularity across narrative genres, from theater to literature and film. Stefanie's most recent published piece, Trading a Bow for a Machine Gun, Robin Hood's Nationalism and the Personas of Philippine Politics, appeared in the edited volume Medievalism in a Global Age, addresses the occurrence of medievalisms in recent Philippine presidential elections and political propaganda. Next, Olivia Swarthout is a writer, artist, and statistician from Bozeman, Montana, and Berlin, Germany. In 2022, she began Weird Medieval Guys, a social media project dedicated to sharing her favorite images from medieval manuscripts with the world. Weird Medieval Guys has since attracted a following of close to 1 million across several online platforms, and now includes a blog and podcast of the same name, as well as a book published in November 2023. Olivia has previously worked as an archivist in Yosemite National Park in California, and has a keen interest in exploring the ways that digital spaces can help bridge the gap between museums and audiences. And finally, Dr. Mary Wellesley is an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Historical Research and Associate Member of Oxford University's English faculty. Her first book, Hidden Hands, The Lives of Manuscripts and Their Makers, was published by Quercus in the UK and by Basic Books in the US as The Gilded Page, The Secret Lives of Manuscripts. It was chosen as one of the history books of the year by the Sunday Times and BBC History magazine. After her PhD, she worked for several years in the manuscripts department of the British Library, and alongside her academic publications, Mary writes widely for a general audience and is a regular contributor to the London Review of Books and the New York Review of Books, among others. And she is the co-host of a hit podcast on medieval literature produced by the London Review of Books. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Mary, we'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about, since this is the Medieval Academy's Graduate Student Committee, how your transition from graduate school and sort of a traditional academic background to public-facing work was?
Well, I mean, in practical terms, I was writing journalism throughout my PhD. And I think if I was to give a little piece of advice to people who are kind of interested in doing something a bit like what I do, I think it's just to try and get a really good body of work that's not behind a paywall out there, so that there is something that you can show editors. And also just not to be afraid to pitch, because most editors are always seeking new, interesting writers, and especially writers who have a kind of specialist, field of knowledge and want to write about something that's maybe a little bit arcane, but write about it in an accessible way. And so it just pitch. Don't feel ashamed. Don't feel embarrassed. Just go for it. That would be my one piece of advice. So then for me, I worked for the British Library after I finished my PhD. And then when my contract came to an end, by that point, I already had an agent and I had an idea for a book. And so I went away and worked on it. But it's it is a big shift. I think looking back on the book now, I think I maybe was a little too academic in places. And I think it's very hard to make that transition from worrying about the real granular detail of things in a way that we're all like hugely invested in doing, to thinking a bit more kind of loosely and broadly and perhaps more playfully about the material in front of you. So it's quite a hard road, but it's really worth it.
Yeah. So the podcast that you run, that's, as I said, produced by the LRB and that you run with Irina Dumitrescu, is it's wonderful, and I would really suggest anyone who's listening who's interested to check it out. Is there something about the medium of podcasting specifically and that you find different or fruitful than writing, sort of traditional public-facing writing?
Yeah, I think that definitely. Well, one of the great things about that podcast for me is that Irina and I didn't really know each other when we started making it, and we've become great friends. And I hope that comes across, that we have a very similar sense of humor and we just enjoy talking to each other. I think what's quite nice is that we have kind of sort of aligned but quite different research interests, and so we sort of bring different things to one another. One of the things that I really love about it is that it's given me a sort of sense of freedom about exploring material that I definitely would have been too frightened to explore in a kind of scholarly medium. So, literature in other languages, which I've read in translation, and like the kind of podcast format, it's kind of okay for me to like look at stuff where I don't speak the original, I can't read the original language, because it is a looser, freer medium. And I think that is the great joy of it, is suddenly you think, oh, I'm kind of interested in this thing, and then you just go off and look at it.
Cool. I'd like to bring in John here, who also has experience in podcasting and runs the Multicultural Middle Ages podcast, which started out as an MA GSC project. And so first, sort of, how did you start? You became interested in podcasting, and I suppose this is partially for both of you. What kind of reaction have you had from doing a podcast and that's different from other stuff?
I think the format is going to be very somewhat different, right? Because we do that call for proposals, and from the beginning, and we always envisioned the multicultural Middle Ages to be a platform, right? For that we could loan out. So we do produce our own episodes, and we pursue whatever we're interested in, and we try to emphasize kind of like a global perspective to the extent that we're able. But what we really want with the podcast is to lend it out, right? So we want people that maybe don't know how or don't feel confident doing their own podcast to kind of like, well, I'm excited about this. I could do a podcast episode. I don't want to do a series about it. So we're like, great. If you're passionate, we'll work with you. We'll help you. We'll workshop it, or we'll do the editing for you if the technology is a gap. And then we can just get it out there, and you can share the research you're excited about, and we can bring in the technical know-how, or if you need us to interview you or something, right? But besides that, I think it's very much along the lines of what Mary was describing, right? Like there is a lot to be said for public scholarship and creating this kind of public-facing content, right? And no one, even though that's how, if you're following a traditional academic track, that's how the cookies are counted, right? Like what publications you have and who's citing you and everything. But I don't want to be talking to the 5 people that are interested about what I'm interested only, right? Like I think it definitely is can gather interest beyond that. And that is perhaps the reason why we do this. And I will also say that there is a lot of value in taking on a project like this one as a group. And from its beginning, like I may have had a crazy idea to begin it, but had I not had my fellow GSC members, Logan Quigley and Rito Mera especially, right, helping me out from the beginning, it would not have happened. And now we're growing, and we have Will Beatty and Lauren Lee. So it's always been a labor of love, and it's definitely fun, right? Like I'm not getting a lot of institutional cookies for this, but we wouldn't do it if it wasn't fun. So yeah, so it's part of the joys of doing this.
And
Yeah, and I
do you
think
d-
that's
oh,
no, I was just going to say that I think that is what people want to hear. They want to hear us having fun with the material. And I think, one thing I probably should have said before is that one of the great things that the podcast format offers you is the ability to hold multiple interpretations simultaneously, and for the audience to hear you working through a problem. And I think that's something that Irina and I always try and have, is that we try not to have too much of a kind of interpretation or a take on a text that we're discussing. And sometimes it actually helps rhetorically for us to come at it from quite a different angle, and sometimes we sort of agree to disagree, and I think actually the listener enjoys hearing that complexity being presented.
totally, I really agree. Do either of you find that the kinds of audiences that you get from a podcast is different than what you would get from another type of medium? Or is it sort of hard to know?
I mean, it's very hard to know, who's listening, or
Mhm.
I mean, I assume people listen.
Yeah, it's the big mystery, and we're asked, and I'm like, the kind of like RSS feeds gives you a sense of where they're listening to it, right? Like, oh, in the UK or in the US or everything. But beyond that, like more identifiable data, it's very hard to say. So if you like the podcast, let us know, and let us know what kind of
Yeah.
content.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Great.
I was actually talking to my editor, my UK editor, and we were talking about the kind of dynamics of podcast, the relationship between publishing and podcasting. And they were saying that there's this kind of fascinating phenomenon where people can have a really successful podcast, and then they have a book deal that comes on the back of that, and then it doesn't seem to make a difference to the book sales. So it seems like the audience is actually quite distinct. The people that are reading books on a subject and the people that are listening to the podcast. So
That is very interesting. Huh. Well, John, I'd like to ask you about another aspect of the work that you do, which is that I heard you over the summer speak in a very lovely way about the work that you do with incarcerated people. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what that work is and what you've been doing?
Yeah, yes. And so if I cut out, everyone, apologies. Hurricane Helena is taking us in South Carolina, but I'm somehow in a bubble and I still have power. So, but that might change any moment. But the work I've done with incarcerated students, right, was something I did during my PhD. It's something that I haven't brought to South Carolina since I started my job last year. But I worked, my official title was Instructor of Creative Writing because that's the program that they had in the facilities I worked at, right? It was the State Correctional Institution Banner at Banner Pike in central Pennsylvania. And I also worked with the Center County Correctional Facility, right? And they were both very different experiences. One is a medium security facility. The other is a low security facility. And that only matters because of the time that people spend in those places, right? So yeah, you go from an average of 6 months in Center County Correctional Facility to 6 years in an SCI Banner, right? And definitely I did not start at it as a creative writing class. I approached it as a creative writing class, which is what I understood, right? But 2 weeks in, I noticed that the students were just, this is what they have on the table. And what some of them wanted to do was read stuff together, right? So I was able to start bringing in text and we would read collectively and then add like a creative writing assignment. So the officer that was there in the classroom with me wouldn't say, this is not a creative writing class, right? But that already gives you a perspective of how different from a university classroom this is, right? And this is something I always wanted to do and didn't have the opportunity to do during my undergrad or my MA, but ever since I started desiring to be a medievalist, right? It was a history professor during my undergraduate in the University of Puerto Rico, and he was a brilliant Jesuit scholar, a leading scholar in Puerto Rican history, but he was actually trained as a medievalist. His PhD was in medieval history, right? And I knew that he, after class, he had to run because he was going to go teach history in local prisons, right? And that was a beautiful image of the medievalist that I always got, you know, like our responsibility does not end in an institutional setting. It's not confined there, right? And that is, I guess, in a way what I strove to become. And when I had the opportunity to do that through the Restorative Justice Initiative at Penn State, where I was doing my PhD, then I said, absolutely, sign me up. I want to do this. And I will say that it's been the most formative experience for me as a teacher. It has impacted the way I approach pedagogy in every possible way, right? And it has really made clear to me the potential that bringing in medieval sources to these spaces, right, not the traditional spaces of higher education, it can help us do a lot, right? When I go there, just to give you a sense of how it's different from a traditional humanities classroom in a college setting, right? I learned very quickly that I could not assume literacy in my students, right? They were, that is not to say that they were not smart or they were not engaged, right? Like I learned that many of them would read together, you know, some of them were not able to read and they would, before class, they would sit together and read collectively, right? And share that. And they brought thoughts, they were engaged in class and everything. So, but it forced me to think about multiple modes of engagement, ones that were not as traditional, right? And that is something that I now bring outside of that setting. Also, I saw some hesitation from students, right, for the creative assignment or creative writing portion because they were concerned that, oh, I don't know how to spell correctly or that kind of thing. And that's where I really saw the potential of bringing in the stuff I study, right? Bringing in medieval sources where standardized orthography, it's not a thing. And we never think less of Chaucer because he's not consistent in his spelling, right? So yeah, we don't think less of any of our medieval sources because for a lack of consistency in orthography. And just bringing that and presenting them with those materials and telling them, we've studied this for 700 years and orthography was not a thing. So don't let that stop you. Come and do it. It should not be a problem for you to produce what the poem you want to produce or the story that you've been thinking about in your head as well, right? And that made it so much better. And if I may add one more thing before passing the talking stick, the experiences were very different, right? At SCI Banner, I was working with with a group of the men's unit. I was working with the men's unit in SCI Banner, whereas when I then transitioned to Center County because SCI locked down and did not let us come back after COVID started, I moved to Center County Correctional Facility, and there I started working in the women's unit. And that was a whole different experience, but it also made space a lot of it enriched me as a scholar, right? And I remember, because at that time I was reading in seminar the book of Marjorie Kemp, and I'm like, it's the book of Marjorie Kemp is one of the hardest things for me to read. It's one of the things I love discussing the most, because it's just, there's so much in there, right? But I did not know how to approach it from my own personal experience, right? So I said, well, I have to teach a class, I have to read the book of Marjorie Kemp for my class. So yeah, why not try an experiment? Why not bring this to and read it together with these women, right? And the kind of, for them, it was completely obvious, like I brought like random moments of the book and they could engage with it completely, like they're like, I perfectly understand what she's saying. And so the classroom completely flipped. And I'm like, can I take your paper? Because I'm the one who needs to take notes, like I need to bring this to my graduate seminar. So discussing these sources that we're excited about, but that have often been discussed in very small, airtight circles sometimes, taking those texts outside, like it can get people excited about them, and they can bring fresh new perspectives that we're not thinking about because we're trained in very strict career paths or thinking patterns, right? So yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, that's amazing, and it's a great transition to Stefanie, what you worked on, which again is sort of the way that people from non-traditional or not sort of European backgrounds engage with the European Middle Ages. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your research and what you found.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Matilda. So essentially what my research does is it looks at the manifestation, the ideas of the European Middle Ages that popped up in the Philippines, starting from the Spanish colonial period moving forward. So what happened was we see a lot of medieval narratives from the matter of France, a couple bits from the matter of Britain, but a lot of hagiographies, a lot of Spanish legends really become quite popular during the Philippines, during the colonial period. And when we talk about the colonial period, I'm talking, for the Spanish colonial period, it was between 1565 to about 1898. And so we see a lot of these narratives come to the Philippines. Scholars have talked about, Miguel Legazpi. It was his soldiers that first brought these stories that were transmitted orally, became very popular, that were adapted in native languages. And so we see these narratives most popularly performed on stage, called comedias. And they became so integrated into the social culture that they became like required fare at town celebrations for the patron saint. So we see these comedias being performed so often, and participating in the performance earned someone a kind of social badge because they got to portray, say, the king or the prince, and that came with a bit of social elevation as well. People can brag that, hey, I played Bernardo del Carpio, right, at this particular commedia play. So it was really interesting. It was an interesting phenomenon because, it was so popular. Although this idea of the Middle Ages just seemed so far away and different, right, than what we imagine, what the Philippines would imagine. The idea of the idea of the Middle Ages in the Philippines, the way that it manifested there is actually quite different than the way that we think of the Middle Ages, right? So to give an example, I was actually at a presentation a couple months ago by a game maker. He was creating this computer game that was based around the Arthurian legends. And he was very proud of the fact that that the characters that he was creating were as faithful as possible to the original source material. And in fact, he wanted to include some homosexual relationships, in the storylines. But his boss said, only if it's in the original material. If you could find those kinds of relationships in the original material, then sure, by all means, you can do that. And he said that he couldn't find any, which to me was kind of like, where are you looking? He was also quite pleased by the fact that he was able to include a character that was ostensibly Middle Eastern, because we have those figures among the knights of Arthur's Round Table, and so in that way, it's authentic. And for me, listening to this presentation, I couldn't help but think, well, when we talk about authentic, what are we talking about here, right? Because in the Philippines, someone thinks about, say, King Arthur, or they think about Bernardo del Carpio. They might think of the Filipino actor Cesar Ramirez, who portrayed Bernardo del Carpio famously in a film in 1951 that was very popular in the Philippines, or other stage actors that took on these roles. They don't think of figures with white skin and blonde hair necessarily. They think of, these characters were portrayed by Filipino actors. That's what people think of. Percival, when he's going on these quests, he's in towns where the houses are described as nipa huts. Okay, so I mean, again, the idea of the Middle Ages, what kind of Middle Ages are we talking about? There are a lot of different kinds of Middle Ages, and my research has reinforced that to me, right? It's also reinforced, how problematic the idea of an original or authentic source can be, because the idea of something having come first, being original, during the Spanish colonial period was weaponized a lot against these very popular Philippine productions. It's not as good. These are monstrous versions of the Spanish originals. And they were looked down upon, so much so that it became quite commonplace to really denigrate a lot of these performances. So much so that I would argue that it really seeped into kind of national discourse, during the early years of independence during the U.S. occupation, to look down on these Filipino-made cultural productions, in literature, in theater, and even in film. Even though that, very much so, I would argue that these are Filipino productions, right? These are Filipino stories. But because of ideas of what medieval is, ideas of what being a modern Filipino is, right? We can't think of these things that way. So, my research has been really interesting, and in a lot of ways, I do want to also establish my positionality with this. I'm not Filipino, having grown up in the Philippines. I am a Filipino American. And so, the lens through which I look at the idea of the Middle Ages is colored by having grown up in the US, my education here. It's not the same way that, say, the idea of the medieval is seen in the Philippines. I would actually say one of the most interesting things that I run into is that when I look at this material that I would call medieval, this literature, I find that people don't use that term when they talk about it. I actually had a really well-known Filipino scholar walk up to me after a presentation I gave a couple years ago about a very famous Filipino text that I talked about as kind of like medieval literature, medievalism literature. And he walked up to me afterwards and he's like, I've never thought about it that way, but I guess you're right. So that is to say that, this material has also become so normalized that it's not recognized as foreign. So on one hand, there's that. On the other hand, there's kind of like this nationalist discourse that this didn't come from us originally, so we can't claim it as ours, and it doesn't showcase what it is to be a Filipino. So, it's not given as much importance as, say, other pieces of Filipino literature, right? That, reflect more realistic ideas of what being a Filipino is.
That's so interesting. And just as we're talking about sort of, I think there's such an interesting distinction between sort of what is medieval and what is medievalism. And I think on that note, I'll turn to Olivia. And for those of you who don't know, Olivia runs a very, very popular, as I said, Twitter account where you post screenshots of usually creatures that are found in the margins of medieval manuscripts. How did you become interested in those figures?
Well, first of all, just making sure you can still hear me all right, because my connection has been a bit dotty. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I think it's hard to say exactly because everyone grows up with these ideas of the Middle Ages, probably really nebulous ones. So it's hard to say what, of course, the initial sort of beginning of that was, but I think what really put me on to what I'm doing right now was my work in the archives in Yosemite National Park, working as a photo archivist and working a lot in digitization and all of the work that entails, and the housekeeping and the admin, and doing it in the name of the public domain, because these were public domain photographs that we were putting online in a way that was intended to be accessed by people so they could take these pieces of history and download them and use them in transformative ways where they were incorporating them into something else. And so that really put me onto how much of this is out there, how much public domain material, and the sort of broad spectrum of how accessible these different resources are, that some of them are really put out there for people to use. Some of them are very closely guarded, even if they are technically public domain. The people who have access to them can be quite touchy about who actually uses them and who, should, and the relationship that people should have with them, the actual sort of like intellectual relationship people have with something that's public domain. And I think that was sort of part of what made me want to share these things and share them as broadly as possible, was because I absolutely love the public domain. I think it's one of the most important things for reaching people, and especially coming from more of a scientific background, where in science, and especially in computing and programming, the thing to do once you've made something is to put it out there in sort of all of its glory, with everything available to people so they can take it and make it their own and improve on it and change it. Of course, historical materials aren't quite the same, but I really wanted to open up people's eyes to the fact that these things were out there, and they were out there for them, even if it didn't always feel like that, because it's part of global cultural history. And even if the way that I present it to people is, of course, lighthearted and humorous, I just, really wanted to make it accessible and available and make people aware of what's out there, because that's sort of the first question people often ask me, is like, where do you find these things? And it's like, well, they're all out there. Anyone can find them, but few people do.
Yeah. And what sort of responses to the project have most surprised you?
I think just in general, the sort of I think in general, the sort of just diversity of voices and people that have kind of spoken up and identified with different pieces of artwork, and that have incorporated pieces of artwork into their own pieces of art. It's of course hard to say with some things whether I was an influence or I was involved. But yeah, I think in general, it can be kind of a bugbear for medievalists, the way that people who are not part of the medievalist community engage with the Middle Ages, in that there are a lot of misconceptions, there are a lot of preconceived notions of what medieval life meant. But I think the flip side of that is just that even if it does come via these preconceptions, people already have this really strong desire to engage with medieval culture and medieval history, and it's not something that they really need like a motivation or a justification for. People really do want to access it and to feel like they're part of it. And so, yeah, I think even people who I really you know, from my own sort of limited perspective, wouldn't have expected things to resonate with. I mean, the number of followers, for instance, as an example, I have who are queer or trans, and for whom like a lot of medieval imagery of things that could be considered monstrous or could otherwise be interpreted as a depiction of something the artist might have thought was, you know, not quite right or not quite human. The idea that, and the number of people, you know, when confronted with an image like that, actually feel a sense of kinship with it and see themselves reflected in it. I think that was really, really interesting to me, because it is kind of, to me, a good encapsulation of how people can take a piece of imagery or a piece of historical documentation and make it their own in a way that's transformative.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, I think so much of the question that we're revolving around is sort of who owns the Middle Ages, right? Like, especially, and I mean, and here we're mostly talking about the European Middle Ages. My own research looks at West Africa, and that is also part of it, right? Is who, when we say the Middle Ages, do we mean England and France, or do we mean a sort of broader conception of that world? And that's one of the things that's so wonderful about the Multicultural Middle Ages podcast, for instance. I think I'll now open up to sort of group questions. So if whatever you wish to respond to, please do. And for the audience, if you have any questions come up, I see somebody has already added a question to the chat, but please continue to use either the chat or the Q&A if you have anything that you'd like the panel to discuss. I guess maybe this is a bit of a silly question, but you know, what first got you guys excited about the Middle Ages? We weren't all academics from the cradle. What made you think that the Middle Ages could be yours too? Yes, Stefanie, if you want to pick somebody at random.
So just in terms of what got me interested in the Middle Ages, cartoons, honestly. One of my favorite cartoons from when I was young was King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and it was a time travel story. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this cartoon, where somehow Arthur and his knights, they get captured and kind of like frozen, and so Merlin has to recruit this football team from the future to go back in time and like masquerade as Arthur and his knights. So the quarterback becomes King Arthur, and like, you know, his teammates, they become the knights, and it's very kind of like Power Rangers-esque, where they have like, they transform and they have weapons. I loved it as a kid. I thought it was great. So I mean, stories like that just seemed really fun. I was also a really big fan of gargoyles. I don't know if anybody watched Gargoyles, but you know, the premise, Matilda, are you familiar with Gargoyles, the Disney gargoyles? Yes. Okay. Yeah. A lot of Shakespeare, a lot of mythology in there, a lot of Celtic mythology. Yeah. And so, you know, these gargoyles were from the medieval period in Scotland. And I think for me, I just loved, again, how it, you know, going beyond that, I saw so many other stories that did a really good job of weaving in even, say, Native American mythology into the stories. So the way that, you know, what I was thinking about the Middle Ages initially as a kid was bringing in elements from other parts of the world, because they traveled, right, at some point in the story. You know, really kind of opened my eyes to kind of how vibrant and varied ideas of the Middle Ages can be, and how it can connect to so many things.
Yeah, I love the Magic Treehouse books. I don't know if any of you read those, but my favorite ones were always the ones where they went to the Middle Ages. Anybody else? John?
For me, it was definitely like many medievalists. I think medievalism was the way in. In my case, it was fantasy books and video games, right? And growing up in Puerto Rico, like it was actually, we don't get like dubbed material when it's kind of video games or books for a long time. So, I mean, perks of being a colony, right? So it forced me to kind of like, I was playing my games and sitting with an English dictionary and really practicing my English, which I was learning in school still. And I got very good in it. And that kind of evolved into a love for languages. So when I went to undergrad, I started pursuing languages. And then I'm like, okay, how can I make a career out of this? And I am a comparatist by training, comparative literature, which likes a lot of languages. And then I had to choose a specialization. And I'm like, why not the Middle Ages? It's fun. I like the stories. It's what I enjoy reading outside, kind of medieval-esque settings and everything. And it's harder than most people doing contemporary stuff, I will say. So yeah, so I'm like, yeah, why not? Why not? So yeah, so it was, I guess, it's snowballed from different places, and then I arrived here, and I love it. Like there's something to medieval studies that's inherently interdisciplinary and often invites collaboration, right? Like there's no way that you can know everything. And I've always found that I enjoy doing my work the most when it has that kind of collaborative element in it. And I think everything that we do benefits from collaboration and dialogue. Yeah.
Amazing. Mary Olivia, or shall I move on?
I guess to say one thing, I think as a sort of, someone who grew up on the internet and, not entirely on the internet, of course, but as someone for whom, the internet was part of my sort of formative growing up years, I think that there was always something about sort of medieval imagery and medieval culture that like people kept circling back to on the internet, that it's clearly something that people feel like can, is quite instantly like relatable and funny and quirky and goofy. And so I very much, grew up or as a sort of young teenager, there was kind of like constant, all of these like medieval meme accounts and sort of different ways that people would like use the concept of like medievalness for humor. And I think, that was also, I think maybe because I was quite a contrarian child as well, often, kind of sparked my first interests in the period, because I was often, would wonder like, well, actually, where do these things come from? And like, how much truth is there to this?
Yeah, wonderful.
I mean, I don't think I have anything very useful to say about this, but I suppose, Olivia, the word weird is one that kind of resonates with me in a way. I think that is what brings me again and again to the texts and the artifacts of the Middle Ages, is just the incredible weirdness by comparison with our own culture. And I think that, that's a sort of really brilliant choice on your part to choose that word, because I think it does kind of encapsulate so much of the sort of magic and the sort of cognitive dissonance of the Middle Ages for us today.
Totally. Yeah, the Middle Ages feels foreign, but also familiar in a way that's very fun to play around in. Sorry, did I interrupt someone? Olivia.
No, not at all. I was just saying that, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think a lot of people feel like they're, weird guys, if not medieval, then, it's something we can all relate to.
Definitely. Just, the four of you have very different perspectives. But what do you think is the thing, if there is one thing or a thing, that keeps people from sort of non-traditional academic backgrounds from becoming interested in the Middle Ages?
I can jump in because I see that Robert Welch asked a similar question in the chat, so maybe I can answer. And I think that one of the things that kind of like set us back, or kind of like is a barrier for jumping into this train, right, is the idea that the only viable professional outlet is a traditional academic job, right? Which is great to hear from everybody here, to see the many branches that it can take, right? Like as medievalists, like you are trained to learn languages, to read manuscripts. You're trained to do hard stuff, complex stuff. You can, and those are transferable skills. And I don't think that we often they're often articulated as transferable skills, but doing paleography, doing language learning, doing translation, doing close reading and textual analysis, that is, all of those are skills that will benefit any career path, right? Especially now that the academic job market is not great, but also I'm not arrogant enough to think that everyone who wants to study these things wants to pursue a traditional academic track, right? And that is often that assumption, especially from the ones doing the mentoring, is often an obstacle for people getting excited and pursuing this. And sometimes you just want to learn about the period and the artifacts and everything, and you can take that elsewhere to another professional track, and I will say, when I was a member of the GSC, what feels like a lifetime ago, like the requests we got for programming were often, how did medievalists take their training and go into non-academic tracks, right? So there is an interest, there is a paradigm shift, and I think we really need to lean into that to really emphasize the plurality of outcomes that can come out of a training as a medievalist in whatever field.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in what people think about. I mean, if you take, a sort of key medievalist skill, paleography, to some degree, paleography has been hugely democratized in the last, 10, 15 years as a result of digitization. But there is a sort of question. I mean, certainly in the UK, we have a sort of terrible funding crisis in the university sector, and there just isn't the same kind of teaching that there was. And so it's an interesting question if an institution like the British Library, for example, digitizes all of its manuscripts and makes the manuscripts readable for anyone across the world, but there isn't the teaching there to help people interpret them. Is that a bit of an own goal? I mean, I don't know what people think. I don't know what I think about this, but is that making it easier or harder for people? Is it actually forbidding and off-putting for people to see this like very complicated material? Or is it actually sort of intriguing and makes them want to try and learn these strange and arcane skills to interpret the material?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd also be, oh, sorry, Olivia, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, I think that it's really helpful if people feel like they have a resource or a platform that's like intended for them, because I think that oftentimes when you're outside of academia, if you try to enter into a conversation that's being led by academics, it feels like, walking into a room and everyone goes quiet and it's like, oh gosh, well, I don't actually know if I can sort of, make it on my own in this sphere. And I think that, for instance, coming from a degree that I did in statistics, where I've worked with like a lot of citizen science data and public engagement that led to people, using apps and using online platforms that were very democratic and were oriented towards people who were lay people, in that they were giving them, the appropriate sort of advice and instructions and saying like, okay, and now you can go out and you can make a little contribution and you can then send it, back to the whole, to the collective, and there can be people who can look over it and check it, and it will sort of contribute to something. I think, yeah, that sense of having like a place that's, really helpful for getting people involved.
But do you think, for example, that repositories, libraries, or university collections should be doing more to produce digital resources that are kind of like a sort of an online tutorial on paleography, for example? I mean, do you feel like there is enough to help people who don't have the training interpret the materials, or is it kind of enough actually that perhaps they see this material through accounts like yours, and maybe it's a bit disembodied, but it still makes them excited by the material?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it depends in large part what the intention is. I mean, if the intention is to get people to engage with the material on what's perceived as a deeper level because we see that as an inherent good, then yeah, of course we can always be doing more. If it's, on the other hand, I think if you look at, for instance, a program I really like is the Kew Gardens Public Transcription Project, where in that case the intention is actually to get people involved in helping out people who are academics and in actually managing the collections. And I think that that's also an amazing initiative because it goes to show that people, you know, even though, of course, you know, the skills that you need to do proper paleography are a little bit more in depth. I think it goes to show you that like people will sit down and spend their own time doing something for free for absolutely no promise of recognition or compensation because they want to just be part of something and they identify with it.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. And the mention of that helped me transition to my last question before we move to audience questions. And is there something, I mean, John, you spoke so wonderfully about your students and how they helped you think differently about Marjorie Kemp. And I know that some of the most generative conversations that I've had about my research have been with like somebody at a party, you know, that I'm like, I say something to them and then they respond something that's not a specialist response, but is so appropriate and so true that it sort of gets me out of the sort of one-track mind that I've been joining the literature. And I was curious if either you guys have had moments of that kind, or sort of how you think differently about the Middle Ages or about medievalism, having engaged with other people, non-academics.
I have an activity I like to do in class, and I just did it 2 weeks ago in my Arthurian legend class, right? And we were discussing the Knight of the Cart, right? And it's the kind of the text that allows me to talk about chivalry and courtly love to them and explain the concepts to them. And then after we finish our discussion, I divide them into groups of 3-4 people, and I give them skits, right? Like, okay, this is the term. You have chivalry or you have courtly love, and you have to explain it to a class of a 12th grade high schoolers, right? How would you approach that as a lesson? Or group 2, you have to explain it to your grandparents who are curious about the Middle Ages but know nothing about it. Or I want you to explain courtly love to your friends at a party, you know, and that kind of thing. So it forces them to think about audience and to already take this things that we're learning in the humanities classroom, right, and articulated for a broader audience, right? So in a way to kind of like bring that knowledge out and make sure that they're conversant about it, because often it's, oh, they're not gonna care. And I'm like, it's great gossip to think about the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. Anyone, if you tell it as a gossip story, anyone is in it. Anyone is in for it. Okay, so you have to think. So it's perhaps stressing how not only to recognize terms and define them, but also to be able to produce them, emphasize production. And that's something they can take away, I think. That's kind of valuable.
Does anybody have anything else to add, or shall we go to audience questions? Great. So again, if anybody else has any other questions, please add them to the chat. So our first question is from Esther Cuenca, who I believe this is for you, Stefanie, though I suppose if anybody else has something to add on this subject, please chime in. But she asks if Spain's Black legend plays into any medievalisms in the Philippines, especially when it was under Spanish occupation.
Yeah, Esther, can you clarify what you mean when you say Black legend? Or anyone? I mean, what that's in particular reference to? I mean, I have some notions, but I want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing.
Maybe while Esther adds that, I'll go to the next question. So Kim Kruger would like to know, for those who have more non-traditional, i.e., or actually non-traditional podcasts, etc., avenues of portraying the Middle Ages, have you experienced negative feedback from the academic community? And if so, how have you dealt with such feedback? Or it's all been good?
You go.
I mean, I've been kind of in a hole, not really looking at my social media and having babies. So I'm sure there has been lots of negative feedback, but I have no idea.
Maybe that's actually the wisest course of action.
Yeah, I'm kind of like an anchorite.
John?
In my case, I'm thinking about it. Not really, right? But also, we didn't have social media for the podcast for a long time until our great colleague Rita O'Mara finally took it upon herself to get us started a couple years in. But since I do work, since I am employed in an English department, right? I will say that my immediate colleagues are always very curious about this project, right? And they're always asking, oh, are you still doing it? How's it going? So I found great support from the colleagues in my department. Beyond that, I don't think the university cares about this project in terms of credit for like tenure reviews or anything, right? So that's perhaps why I describe it as a labor of love, and it's something that we really enjoy doing. But it's not something I'm getting academic credit for in this kind of traditional setting, I would say.
Cool. Olivia,
Which
have
shouldn't
you
be the case because it's a lot of work and the research is, and it's
already
time invested. Okay, I said my piece.
Olivia, have you ever gotten hate mail from academics?
No, actually, I think that like in terms of, online different sort of academic spheres I've engaged with, medievalists are, I would say, far and away one of the nicest. I think it's just a field that's filled with really sweet people. I can only assume there's just something about medievalism that attracts really nice people. And I think people, at the end of the day, I think that academics mostly aren't, I mean, or maybe I'm wrong about this, but at least with regards to the podcasts that I have and the social media that I have, I don't think it's where academics are like going for their information. And I think people are, for the most part, especially with the Twitter and the Instagram, because it is quite public, just sort of happy to see people engaging with it, and enjoying it. And I think, where people do kind of push back on things, people are very good natured, actually. It's kind of astonishing. Like people, the rude and aggressive people are, time and time again, the people who know absolutely nothing about the subject material.
That's great and very flattering to us. Sorry, so Stefanie, to return to Esther's question, she writes, it was an anti-Catholic picture of Spain as a backward medieval state, mostly propagated by Protestant authors, Spain as a place of horrible inquisition and superstition, etc.
Okay, yes. So I had mentioned earlier that when I've encountered Filipinos talk about this, Philippine medievalism material, they don't use the word medieval, right? So this goes to even looking at secondary sources, work by scholars from the early 20th century. Where I did see the word medieval pop up quite a bit was in fact in reference to Spain. And Spain, being medieval, made the Philippines in turn medieval. The Philippines having not been medieval before. And this is a lot of the nationalist discourse that came about during, leading up to revolution and, independence from Spain. That, a lot of this discourse was used, particularly in the so-called national, well, it's considered the national epic of the Philippines, the novel by Jose Rizal, where he does talk about the Catholic Church and Spain in this way, that it is backwards, it is savage, and they have turned us Filipinos into backwards and savage. That's why we like these theater plays, about Bernardo del Carpio, was because Spain is medieval and backwards. Now they've caused us to like this stuff, and now we're backwards and savage as well. And so, I mean, certainly this, this way of thinking really seeped its way into national discourse. And it's really worked against, I think, the ongoing popularity of this material. It really faded out in the 20th century because it started to be seen as actually anti-Filipino because it doesn't represent who we are, because we're not backwards the way that Spain is backwards, right? According to this mode of thinking. One other comment that I want to make, after having listened to what everyone else on the panel works on and does, which is really amazing. You guys are doing really fascinating and fun work, it sounds like. I feel like, the problem that I see is a bit of the opposite when we talk about public medievalism, is that in the Philippines, this stuff has always been so public, right? That it's actually regarded as unimportant because it's always been so accessible. Because during the colonial period, the stuff that was kept from us, like the Spanish language, they very purposely did not teach the Spanish language to Filipinos because it was painted as this language of prestige. So this is how we can keep our power from the Filipinos. And so part of the nationalist discourse was actually, in the late 19th, early 20th century, was to allow Filipinos to learn Spanish. So Jose Rizal actually spoke Spanish fluently, and he was a major proponent of more Filipinos learning the Spanish language. So, because the stuff was so accessible, it just has never really seemed like it was good stuff for Filipinos to really concern themselves about. And again, the sentiment still exists today. That's why this stuff isn't studied seriously, in universities or institutions. Really, it's like I said, it's considered very lowbrow. So, it's always been accessible to people. But, it's just, like I said, no one really cares about it that much. So, sorry, long.
No, that's fascinating. No, that's fascinating. And I think a very good reminder that these things aren't the same everywhere. Especially not when sort of it's being displaced by colonialism and things like that. I had another question, which is maybe as the representative of the GSC, what advice would you guys give graduate students who are listening, who are interested in looking outside the academy for these kinds of interactions with the public, or with sort of a different perspective on medieval sources or medievalisms than the ones that you get within it? Are there, for instance, places that you're surprised that more people aren't looking for those kinds of experiences? No, great stuff. Everybody's fine. I think people should read more magazines. That's my piece of advice. I think graduate students don't read enough magazines, and I think it means that I think it means that when you get to I took a public humanities class once. My partner is a magazine writer, so I'm biased. But I took a public humanities class once on public facing writing, and it was surprising to see the way that my fellow had clearly just not read a public facing article, and just that there's so much of the way that you learn to talk to the public is to see how other people are talking to the public. And I think sometimes we get a little maybe overconfident about the way in which, well, we write all the time, I just spent my whole day writing. How different is it to write a magazine article than is it to write my dissertation? But it's of course a very different kind of thing. I hope.
Yeah, I suppose I would say that we all know this from teaching, but the best way to really make sure you know the material is to explain it to somebody else. And I think that's it behooves all of us to kind of, I think sometimes, and I certainly felt that I did this, that there was a kind of laziness sometimes in a paradoxical way about my own academic work, that because I was writing, and I was using jargon and I was writing for this kind of tiny group of people who all knew what I meant, actually, I could be a little bit lazy about what I was saying, and actually trying to explain something to a non-specialist really makes you engage in some ways much more deeply with the material. So I think that's one thing, but I also just think to have fun Like, I think that's the most wonderful thing, to look for the laughter and the jest and the playfulness, because that is often how you're going to attract people to the field, I think.
Amazing. So I have one last question, and then we'll wrap up if there aren't any more questions from the audience. What is your favorite piece of medievalist culture or content that was produced by a non-medievalist?
I think this has been on my mind. Oh, sorry, would you like to go first?
No, go ahead.
I think this has just been on my mind because and this might be a little bit niche, I don't know. It's definitely more of an American thing, because we just wrapped up a 4-part podcast series on Joan of Arc, and it harkened me back to my childhood. One of my favorite television shows was this show called Wishbone, which, if you don't know about Wishbone, it is sort of, each episode is about like a great work of literature, and the main character, and only the main character, everyone else is human, is a dog, an actual sort of live action Jack Russell Terrier who wears little costumes and does, he's got like a voiceover actor, and he is the main character. And that was definitely one of my first sort of exposures to sort of medieval culture, was watching the episode where Wishbone watches Joan of Arc get burned alive, and I thought it was a just sort of fascinating juxtaposition of these different, kids media and wanting to be educational, and having to sort of stick the landing with this narrative. And yeah, there's quite a few different episodes that are based on medieval stories and medieval works of literature, and yeah, Wishbone the dog is the star in all of them.
Mary?
I was just going to say The Toast. Did you guys, I don't know whether maybe this ages me, but I definitely, as a PhD student, I used to look at The Toast a lot. And it's sadly not being written anymore, but it had articles like how to tell if you're in a lay of Marie de France. And it's just in a kind of wonderfully comic way, but also some of the most incisive pieces of literary criticism that I've read. And there's a great one called Dirtbag Beowulf. So yeah, I recommend that.
Yeah, I love The Toast, and Daniel Lavery is still a great person to follow on Twitter. My answer, if anybody's interested in, is, to be honest, my research, I read a lot about eunuchs, and it's very embarrassing because I'm always saying, oh, there's no balanced portrayal of eunuchs. That doesn't exist. That's why you need to give me lots of money for my dissertation. But actually, people are always like, oh, have you read Game of Thrones? And I'm like, oh no, yeah, he did a pretty good job. That was pretty good. And it's very embarrassing that actually George R.R. Martin's portrayal of eunuchs is very good. And those are also great books, and I think very interesting works of medievalism. But John.
I love the Twitter account Chaucer.tweet, definitely. Great. But I think I'm gonna steal Susanna's suggestion in the chat, and I think that Monty Python and the Holy Grail is an epic film. It gets at everything. It's perhaps my favorite comedy movie, and I think in many ways it resonates so well with kind of medieval forms of comedy, right? Like, yeah, that kind of like reduction to absurdity, often in many cases, I can't get enough of it, and I assign it every time I teach. That's my go-to film, and students are like, and they usually like it, even though they no longer know who Harry Potter was, let alone Monty Python, but it actually still works very well, I think, after when we come to the other side and discuss it. And yeah.
Stefanie?
The immediate thing that came to mind after I heard your question was just this much older Filipino film called Príncipe Teñoso that came out in 1954. This particular film and the the production company that was behind it, a Filipino production company, they were known for producing basically these fantasy medieval type narratives, through film. And they had just wonderful costuming, really just beautiful. So that to me just is probably my favorite. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up. I want to say thank you so much to all four of you for joining us this afternoon / evening. I hope to the audience that this has gotten you excited about uncloistering medievalism. And yes, and please check out the MAA on whatever social media you like, or just on the website, and stay in touch. And please let us know if there's any other programming that you would like us to put on. And yeah, so thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matilda.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.